The Soviet sniper had Klaus in his crosshairs for 6 hours. But when the building collapsed and trapped them both in the same basement, suddenly their biggest enemy wasn't each other. It was a cold. Klaus Weber pressed his back against a frozen brick wall, his breath forming small clouds in the bitter December air. The Mosin-Nagant rifle barrel that had been tracking his every movement for the past 6 hours was somewhere in the building across the street. He could feel those crosshairs on like a physical weight point 20 years old, blonde hair now matted with ice and dirt. Klaus had been part of the 24th Panzer Division for 8 months. 8 months that felt like 8 years. When they'd marched into Stalingrad in August, the older soldiers had joked about being home for Christmas. Now, as December wind howled through the skeletal remains of what had once been a proud industrial city, Klaus understood that Christmas might never come. The sniper was good, professional, patient in a way that spoke of training and discipline rather than desperation. Klaus had watched him pick off Sergeant Mueller at dawn, Corporal Franz an hour later. Clean shots, instant kills. No suffering. Klaus almost expected him for that. He'd been pinned in this position since sunrise, unable to move without drawing fire. His stomach cramped with hunger, the last of his black bread consumed yesterday. His water bottle had frozen solid hours ago. But moving meant death, so he waited. The building that housed the sniper was a 5-story apartment complex, or had been before the bombing. Now it was a concrete skeleton, walls blown out, floors collapsed into each other like a house of cards that someone had breathed on too hard. But somewhere in that maze of rubble and twisted metal, a Soviet soldier waited with infinite patience. Klaus shifted slightly, testing. A bullet immediately sparked off the brick inches from his head. Still there, still watching. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd joined the Wehrmacht to see the world, to serve the fatherland, to become a man. His father had fought in the Great War, had stories of camaraderie and purpose. Klaus had expected something noble, something that would make sense. Instead, he'd found Stalingrad a city where children fought with rifles taller than they were, where old women threw bottles of gasoline from windows, where every street corner could hide death, and where the difference between enemy and civilian had blurred beyond recognition. The sound started as a low rumble like distant thunder. Klaus looked up, squinting against the gray sky. American bombers, flying high and steady toward the German positions on the west side of the city. The sound grew louder, engines straining against the thin winter air. That's when he heard the whistle. Artillery. Soviet Katyusha rockets. The Stalin organs that could level entire city blocks. The whistle grew to a shriek, and Klaus pressed himself deeper into his corner, knowing it wouldn't matter. When the rockets found their mark, nothing mattered. The first explosion hit 2 blocks away, the concussion wave rattling his teeth. The second was closer. The third. Klaus never heard the third. When consciousness returned, the world had changed. Everything was wrong. The angle of light, the sound of his own breathing, the weight of debris across his legs. Klaus tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Pain shot through his left shoulder, and something warm and sticky ran down his forehead. He was underground. The building he'd been sheltering against had taken a direct hit. What remained of the first floor had collapsed into the basement, carrying him down in an avalanche of brick, steel, and frozen earth. A pocket of space had formed around him. Miracle or cruel joke, he couldn't decide. Klaus tested his limbs carefully. Left shoulder dislocated, probably. Right leg pinned under a concrete beam, but not broken. Cuts and bruises everywhere, but nothing that would kill him quickly. The cold, however, was a different story. His breath misted in the dim light that filtered down through gaps in the rubble above. The temperature in the basement had to be well below freezing. Without shelter, without heat, he'd be dead within hours. That's when he heard the coughing. Klaus froze, hand moving instinctively toward his Luger. The sound came again, definitely human, definitely close. Someone else had survived the collapse. "WRista," he called softly. "Who's there?" The coughing stopped abruptly. Then, after a long pause, a voice responded in heavily accented German. German? Klaus's blood turned to ice water. The accent was unmistakable. Russian. Ja, Klaus replied carefully, his hand finding the grip of his pistol. German. Another pause. Then, I am also trapped. The voice was young, probably close to Klaus's own age. There was pain in it and exhaustion, but no immediate hostility. Klaus tried to pinpoint the location. Somewhere to his left, maybe 10 feet away, separated by a wall of fallen debris. You are the sniper, Klaus said. It wasn't a question. A bitter laugh echoed through the rubble. Duh. You are the target who would not die. Klaus almost smiled despite everything. Sorry to disappoint. In basement now. No targets. No snipers. Only the Russians search for words. Only cold. Klaus understood. Whatever had existed between them in the world above, hunter and prey, enemy and enemy, meant nothing down here. Here, they were just two men trapped in a tomb, racing against time and temperature. Are you wounded? Klaus asked. Leg is bad. You? Shoulder. But mobile. Klaus hesitated, then made a decision that would have seemed impossible 6 hours ago. My name is Klaus Weber. Another pause. Dmitri Volkov. Names. They had names now. Not German and Russian. Not Wehrmacht and Red Army. Klaus and Dmitri. Dmitri. Klaus said, testing the name, How long do you think we have? Before rescue. Dmitri's laugh was hollow. No rescue. Battle moved east hours ago. Before cold kills us, maybe tonight. Klaus closed his eyes. The mathematics of survival were simple and brutal. Ambient temperature below freezing, no food, no heat source, injuries that would worsen without treatment. Dmitri was right. They had hours, not days. There must be something, Klaus said more to himself than to his invisible companion. Some way to generate heat, to signal for help. Help from who? Dmitri asked. Your army retreats. My army advances. We are forgotten. The hopelessness in the Russian's voice was infectious. Klaus felt despair settling over him like a blanket, warm at first, then suffocating. This was how it would end. Not in glorious battle. Not defending the fatherland, but slowly freezing to death in a basement with an enemy who sounded more like a lost boy than a hardened soldier. No, Klaus said aloud. No, I refuse to accept that. He began exploring his immediate surroundings more systematically. The space around him was roughly triangular, formed by two concrete slabs that had fallen against each other. Debris filled most of it, but careful probing revealed some promising items. Part wooden chair, strips of cloth from what might have been curtains, and, incredibly, a small metal container that sloshed when shaken. Dmitri, Klaus called. I found something. Alcohol, I think. Vodka. Klaus sniffed the container. Something stronger. Industrial alcohol, maybe. Can burn. Dmitri said immediately. Make fire. It was possible. Dangerous. Given their enclosed space, but possible. Do you have matches? Lighter? Niet. You. Klaus patted his pockets. His cigarette lighter, a gift from his sister before deployment, was still there, somehow unbroken. Yes, but we need kindling, something that will catch quickly. For the next hour, they worked together despite being separated by tons of rubble. Klaus gathered combustible materials on his side, with splinters, paper scraps, pieces of fabric. Dmitri talked him through the process of creating a safe fire pit using broken bricks, sharing knowledge learned in the forests of Siberia, where fire meant the difference between life and death. Small fire, Dmitri insisted. Oxygen limited here. Big fire kills us faster than cold. Klaus nodded, then realized Dmitri couldn't see him. Understood. The first flame flickered to life like a tiny miracle. Klaus had torn strips from his undershirt, soaked them in the industrial alcohol, and built a careful pyramid of kindling around them. When his lighter caught the alcohol-soaked cloth, the flame danced blue and yellow in the dim space. Immediately, The quality of air changed. Not just temperature, though the heat was noticeable, but something psychological. Fire meant civilization, meant hope, meant that humans refuse to surrender to the darkness. It works, Klaus called softly. I can feel the heat. Good, Dmitri replied. Now we must make it last. They rationed the alcohol carefully, adding just enough to keep the fire alive without wasting their limited fuel. Klaus fed with splinters to the flames one at a time, each piece chosen for maximum burn time. The light revealed more details of his prison, walls of brick and concrete, twisted metal reinforcement bars, and everywhere the evidence of lives interrupted. A child's wooden toy horse lay crushed under a beam. Family photographs scattered like snow across the debris. Dmitri, Klaus said during one of their quiet periods, "Before the war, what did you do?" A long pause. University. Mathematics. You. Gymnasium still. Was to study engineering after military service. Young for war. 19 when I enlisted. You. 20. Volunteered after Germans invaded. Klaus stared into the flames. A year's difference in age, similar educational backgrounds, both too young to be here. In another time, another place, they might have been friends. Why did you volunteer? Klaus asked. They killed my village, Dmitri said simply. Family, friends, everyone. Klaus felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. I'm sorry. Not your fault. War's fault. But Klaus wondered. He'd been told the Wehrmacht was liberating Russia from communist oppression, that they were welcomed as heroes. The reality he'd witnessed in Stalingrad told a different story. Dmitri, what we did to your people, it wasn't supposed to be like this. What you were told, that we were liberators, that Russians would welcome us. Dmitri's laugh was bitter. Germans told you this? Yes. And Russians tell me all Germans are monsters who eat children. Propaganda, Klaus. Both sides. Klaus nodded slowly. Of course. It was easier to fight monsters than human beings. Easier to kill if you believed your enemy wasn't really human. But you are not monster, Dmitri continued. You share fire. Share warmth. Monsters do not do this. The fire began to die down. Klaus carefully added another alcohol-soaked strip of cloth, extending their bubble of warmth for another precious hour. How many? Dmitri asked quietly. How many of my people you killed? Klaus closed his eyes. The question he'd been dreading. Maybe 8. In combat, I never killed civilians. No, never. Good. Some do. Some enjoy. Not me. I know. Voice tells truth. They fell quiet again. Klaus thought about the men he'd killed. Faces glimpsed through rifle sights. Figures falling in distant windows. Had they been like Dmitri? Young men with families, with dreams beyond this frozen hell. I shot Sergeant Mueller. Dmitri said suddenly. Klaus stiffened. Mueller had been kind to him, protective of the younger soldiers in ways that reminded Klaus of his older brother. He was a good man. Dmitri asked. Yes, Klaus whispered. I am sorry. In war we do not choose. I know. And Klaus did know. That was a horror of it. Understanding that decent people could be forced to do terrible things to other decent people, all in service of causes they barely understood. The fire was dying again, and their alcohol was nearly gone. Klaus estimated they had perhaps 2 more hours of heat. Then Klaus, Dmitri said, when fire dies, we must stay warm other way. How? Share heat. Body heat. Klaus understood immediately. It was survival technique taught to all soldiers when facing exposure. Conserve body heat by staying close together. It was practical, logical, necessary. IT was also the most human thing imaginable. The debris between us, Klaus said. Can you move any of it? Some. Small pieces. You try from your side. They worked carefully, both men understanding that shifting the wrong piece of rubble could bring the rest down on them. But gradually, they opened a narrow passage, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, but sufficient. When Klaus finally saw Dimitri's face in the firelight, he was startled by how young he looked. Blonde hair like Klaus's own, blue eyes that could have belonged to any German boy. The family resemblance was so strong they might have been brothers. "You look—" Dimitri began, then stopped. "Like you." "Very much." Dimitri's left leg was clearly broken below the knee, bent at an unnatural angle. Blood had soaked through his uniform trousers and frozen into dark patches. He was pale from blood loss and cold, but his eyes were alert. "Can you move?" Klaus asked. "A little." "You?" Klaus demonstrated by crawling through the opening, his dislocated shoulder screaming in protest. But he made it through, and for the first time in hours, they were in the same space, not up close. The resemblance was even more striking. They could have been twins, separated by war and politics and the arbitrary lines men drew on maps. The fire had perhaps an hour left. "After that, Klaus," Dimitri said, "I tell you something. When building fell, I was aiming at you, finger on trigger." Klaus met his eyes. "Why didn't you shoot?" "You were crying." Klaus blinked. "What?" "Looking at photograph. Small picture. Crying. I could see through scope. I think this is not monster. This is boy who misses home." Klaus reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small photograph that had somehow survived the collapse. His sister Anna, smiling in their family's garden last spring. He'd been looking at it when the rockets hit, remembering the scent of her flowers, the sound of her laugh. "My sister," he said quietly. Dimitri nodded. "I have sister too. Katya, evacuated to Urals when war started. Is she safe?" "I hope. I pray." They sat together as the fire burned lower. Two young men who should have been enemies, sharing warmth and stories and the terrible intimacy of approaching death. Klaus told Dimitri about his family's farm, about his plans to build bridges after the war. Dimitri spoke of mathematical theorems and the university friends he'd left behind. When the last flame flickered out, they moved closer together without discussion, sharing body heat in the darkness. It should have felt strange, embracing an enemy, but it didn't. It felt like survival. It felt like humanity, refusing to surrender. "Klaus," Dimitri whispered in the darkness, "if one of us lives, if rescue comes, yes, tell them. Tell them we were not monsters. Either of us. I promise." And write to sister. "Anna, tell her. Tell her you met Russian boy who was not so different." Klaus felt tears freezing on his cheeks. "I will. And you'll write to Katya?" "Duh. We'll tell her about German boy who shared fire." They talked through the night, voices growing weaker as cold sapped their strength. Klaus told Dimitri about the Christmas markets in his hometown, the smell of roasted chestnuts and mulled wine. Dimitri described the northern lights over Siberian forests, dancing green and gold across infinite sky. Sometime near dawn, Klaus realized Dimitri had stopped responding. He reached out in the darkness, finding the Russian boy's face. Still warm, but unnaturally still. "Dimitri," he whispered. "Nothing." Klaus held his enemy brother in the darkness, feeling warmth slowly leave the body that had shared heat with him through the longest night of his life. He thought about letters he would never write, sisters who would never know, and the terrible arbitrariness of who lived and who died in war. When the rescue team found him 3 days later, Soviet soldiers following the sound of his weak calls for help, Klaus was barely conscious from cold and dehydration. They pulled him from the rubble and demanded to know what happened. In broken Russian, learned from Dimitri during their final hours together. Klaus told him about the sniper who had saved his life, who had shared fire and warmth and stories in the darkness. He told him about Dmitry Volkov, mathematics student, brother to Katya, enemy to no one who mattered. The Soviet soldiers looked at each other in confusion. A German defending a Russian? A Nazi speaking kindly of the Red Army? It didn't fit their understanding of how war worked. But one older sergeant, a man with kind eyes and gray in his beard, nodded slowly. War makes monsters of some, he said in careful German. But not all. Not you. Not him. Klaus was taken to a Soviet field hospital, then later to a POW camp, where he would spend the next 2 years. He survived the war, returned to Germany, and became an engineer as planned. He built bridges across rivers and valleys, connecting places that had been separated. But his most important construction had happened in a freezing basement in Stalingrad, where 2 young men built a bridge across the no-man's land of ideology and discovered that enemies could be human, that compassion could survive even in war's darkest moments. He never forgot his promise to Dmitri. He never wrote to Anna about the Russian boy. Some truths were too large for letters, but he carried the story with him always. And sometimes on winter nights when snow fell heavy and silent, Klaus would remember a voice in the darkness teaching him how to pronounce Russian words for hope, for warmth, for brother. The war ended, but the lesson remained. That even in humanity's worst moments, when nations convince their children to kill each other for abstract causes, individual humans could still choose compassion over hatred, could still recognize themselves in their enemies' faces. Klaus Weber and Dmitri Volkov met as soldier and sniper, hunter and prey. They parted as brothers, connected by something deeper than politics or propaganda. The simple recognition that suffering was suffering, that cold was cold, and that warmth shared was warmth doubled. In the end, that might be the only victory that matters.